Hi, welcome to Hello Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, author of 100 must-read science fiction novels, 100 must-read fantasy novels, now out of print and quite collectible, I'm afraid. Maybe my publisher will do a reissue. You can probably get a Kindle ebook though, I think, still, but you'll struggle to find one of those. But this is my favourite, really, and my bestseller, as it were. So really what I want to talk about today, this is kind of in the Elements of SF series. I've not done one for a while because we've gone through the basic elements, which I think are important, but I want to look at the question of, with science fiction, do history, context and theory really matter, or can you just sort of wander around in the landscape, you know, and enjoy what's up? And of course you can, but there is a sort of way of looking at it differently. And I just want to draw an analogy with one of my favourite records back in 1978 was a single called Touch and Go by a band called Magazine. And Magazine was sort of like a post-punk band. They quite acclaimed, really good, really great writer and frontman Howard Devoto wrote brilliant songs. And in Touch and Go, he sang the line, "You take your pleasure seriously." And that's always really stuck with me, that line, "You take your pleasure seriously." Because, you know, we read for enjoyment. And I mean, I'm a firm believer. I always say to people at my job as a bookseller, you read what you enjoy. But of course, you know, you want to find new things to enjoy because you stick to the same old stuff and, you know, it can get a bit boring. So, you know, read for enjoyment by all means, and, you know, don't have any boundaries and do what you like. But is there anything more serious than pleasure? Can you think of anything more worth spending your time on than taking your pleasure seriously and, you know, and really sort of going into it and looking at why you like things that lead you to other stuff? So I think that anything that you enjoy really should stand up to sort of close examination in a way. And I find that the closer I've looked at things I like, the greater the pleasure I get. And, you know, as Socrates, the Greek philosopher, said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And what he said was that if you look into things, you know, it enriches your enjoyment, and you look at your life and analyze it, and it works for art. You know, the unexamined life is not worth living. Obviously Socrates wasn't a science fiction writer. He didn't write anything. It was all written down by Plato. Plato wrote it down for him, and Plato, of course, arguably was a dystopian writer, because Plato's Republic is regarded as being not that pleasant a sort of utopia, more of a dystopia. But to move on, I mean, talking about science fiction specifically, one of the reasons why we call it science fiction is that we can use scientific methods to understand and enjoy it. Now, in science, we theorize about why something is so, why it is the way it is. And we devise experiments to test whether the theories that we have will fit the facts and the evidence. So that's the basis of the scientific method. Why is something a certain way? We develop a theory, come up with experiments to test that and see if the evidence and the facts fit the theory. And then, of course, science may start in opinions, but it ends in something objective. It ends in facts. It works consistently, which is why it's science and not magic. When we do experiments in science and, you know, they don't work out, then you have to change your theory, revise the theory and come up with a new theory, then come up with experiments to test that. So if our experiments don't confirm our theories when they're repeated, and it's that repeated proof-making experiments which are central to the scientific method, we go back to that drawing board again and again, redraft the theories, devise new experiments, and keep refining the process until we establish the facts. So a good theory will work in practice, in practical application again and again. And science fiction, just as a sidebar thought here, is often described as a kind of thought experiment literature where the writers come up with an idea, what if, and they do an experiment with it by writing about the implications of what scientific idea they come up with that might change the world is. So it's a thought experiment. So science fiction is philosophy, whether you like that idea or not. This is why definitions of SF are so fascinating, so arguable, and so difficult to reach a consensus on. Writing, of course, is as much an art as a science, but SF is about science and its effects on us. You might think it's just escapism, and if that's the case, well, that's absolutely fine. You're probably reading a fairly low grade of SF, and you probably have a low expectation of it. And that maybe comes from the mass media, and we all come into SF that way. We all come into it via screens first. It's because of the way that technology has changed the world we live, because we've got television, film, what have you. We can't read it on the printed page first, which is of course where it first came from. So SF really is about science and its effects on us. And I'd say an understanding of the scientific method I've just described, of theorizing and testing with experiments until we find a theory that seems to describe SF, is central to something being SF. Now, I think really we all sort of sense this as we read. If we have any sort of feeling for SF, we kind of know this intuitively. It's just some people haven't articulated, and I'm interested in articulating it. So this is why I cite the elements of SF, which I've described: the novum, the new thing, the imagined piece of technology, which causes a paradigm shift for the world to change. And for the reader, this means cognitive estrangement when we're struck, when we read the story of the brave new world that is unveiled by the way the tech has changed society in the book. And then the conceptual breakthrough, where the author takes it further and does more paradigm shifts. And as I've said before, I think some of the best SF, you'll get that towards the very end, in the last paragraph, the last chapter, sometimes in the last word or even the last letter. I've known that happen as well. These things are all part of a theory. Defining SF has been one of my co-interests in the genre for over 25 years, and I've read, heard and discussed all the common theories and some of the uncommon ones. And it's a really knotty problem, but it's really interesting because it does, when you look at the different ideas and you apply them to what you're reading, they can enhance it enormously. So it's a very rewarding thing to do. So myself going through this process has led me to define even what a definition is. You have to think about that. It does make you think, what is a definition? Above all, a definition is a categorical description, especially in relation to something like genre. So it's a description of a category or a thing, or things within a category. So when I was a kid, one of my interests was taxonomy, which has nothing to do with money. Taxonomy is the classification of living things, as sort of designed by the Swiss biologist Linnaeus, who sort of came up with a nomenclature and the structure of taxonomy. So you put living things into different groups. So you'd have different phyla at the top, and phyla would be sort of plants and animals. Within the phylum of animals, you'd have different classes: mammals, reptiles, invertebrates, what have you. Within classes, you'd have orders, like in mammals you'd have carnivores. Within orders, you'd have families: dogs, cats, bears, what have you. So I was all very interested in that categorical thinking. It was scientifically useful because, of course, taxonomy and that classification system was based on the theories of anatomical morphology, the shapes of animals and their anatomy. And increasingly as time goes on, the genetic evidence we can now access today. And I read Steve Brissate's book recently about the rise of the mammals, the guy who had the big bestseller a few years ago, Dinosaurs. And he was arguing that what really makes a mammal isn't sort of the obvious thing you do. It's not essentially the hair and and the milk and what have you, because of course there's monotremes and marsupials, which don't sort of go that way in the same way. He talked about sort of structures in the jaw and how they were different in mammals to reptiles and amphibians and birds. Really interesting stuff. It's quite heavy going. So that's the sort of way it works. So he looked at the detail of the relationships between animals in terms of classifying them. So, and also in genetic evidence backs it up. But as I say, taxonomy is like an evolutionary theory. Some people say it's a hierarchy. It's not a hierarchy. It's a sort of it's a tree, but it's not a tree with a top or a bottom. There is the arrow of time as animals evolve from single-celled organisms up to more advanced forms and what have you. But that is there. So it's an interesting way of looking at things. So I've tried to apply that sort of thinking to my thinking on genre, because it's a scientific theory, and if we're going to be clear about a category and what a genre is, then that's maybe a good way to go. So taxonomy, of course, relies on that theory of evolution, the sort of Wallace and Darwin thing that they reached separately round about the same time. Wallace is a bit earlier, I think, but Darwin sort of took the crown in terms of the thing. So if you look at genre in fiction, I look at it in an evolutionary sense to try to understand genre. I feel you need to look at how stories evolved into fiction from simple storytelling, how realism emerged from more fantastic things when people believed more in superstition and magic and religion, and how science fiction emerged during the Enlightenment, which is the moment in the sort of late 18th century when scientific method asserted its primacy in explaining or trying to explain the universe. And Brian Aldiss wrote the definition of SF in Billion Year Spree, later revised as Trillion Year Spree, or was it the other way round, about how science fiction was a search for man's state of knowledge and his place in the universe. We'll come on to that at another point. I don't think you can understand SF and genre generally without understanding how fiction reflected our intellectual progress through history from superstition and into science. And this is why I claim that really only three genres in fiction: fantasy, which came first, realism, and SF. And, you know, you could argue realism was always there. Realism and fantasy, though, were sort of pretty much indistinguishable for a long time. But you notice I put realism in between fantasy and SF. People tend to sort of lump fantasy and SF together, but actually they're quite different things. But I want to talk about that in another video. I don't think they're as closely related. I think SF is more related to realism than it is to fantasy, but we'll come on to that, as I say, another time. So it's worth sort of saying as well that the very word genre was really used outside academic and critical circles until about 20 years ago. You know, you didn't hear it much in publishing or in bookselling, what I've worked in for years. You didn't use publishers use it very much when they were selling you things. You didn't hear booksellers use it very much. It's sort of come into its own. It's become more popular as the media's expanded and people have thought more about these things. So, you know, so it is a relatively new usage. And as I've said before, I think the meanings of words are defined in dictionaries by experts on language, linguists, but their usage changes as they're popularized. Popular usages, however, are not always reflective of the agreed meanings of those words, as I say in references. You know, those evolutions of language can be degradings, or they can be misunderstanding, or they can be a kind of eloquent expansion of them. They can enhance as well as reduce and limit. And I always think of 1984 here because of Newspeak, the way that Newspeak dictionary is designed in 1984 to limit the range of thought into orthodoxy. So popular doesn't always mean right, as I've said before. So it's worth also remembering that a label like science fiction, you know, was probably first applied really as a category designation for marketing reasons, because of course scientifiction, it was called by Hugh Gernsback when he launched Amazing Stories in 1925, and then a fan in a letter said, why not science fiction, because it's not such a jawbreaker. So, you know, and that magazine was aiming at a certain audience who wanted a certain type of story which already existed. I think it was Norman Spinrad who said that science fiction is any book that has the word science fiction or SF printed on its cover, and you'll notice they don't have sci-fi on their covers, except in quotes by a few contemporary authors. So, you know, that was Norman was saying, and I think he said that in his book Science Fiction in the Real World, which is really good, which I must dig out and reread because it's been a long time. And, you know, this is true to a degree, but how do we decide in the first place what gets labelled as SF? Those books don't appear spontaneously. Somebody somewhere has to make the decision on them being labelled as SF and marketed and packaged as SF. The easiest way to do this is to highlight common elements in categories of story, tropes. So common tropes in SF are obvious things like that we'd all recognise: time travel, advanced space exploration, alien life, artificial intelligences, and so on. So it's how we explain these tropes, though, that matters, and this is what makes science fiction different from general fiction and from fantasy as well. You know, the explanations of the tropes are all concepts born of scientific theory and experimentation, which leads towards the eventual realization and confirmation of a theory in facts. So by looking at these tropes, we see that they're inherently scientific ideas, hence science fiction. This is one reason why I don't use speculative fiction very much, and I'll do a video about that again because the usage of that term is very interesting. It's evolved over time. So we reach science fiction as our label, and you know, there is that thing about it just being a marketing and packaging category. And the critic Damon Knight, is one of the people who famously said science fiction is whatever I'm pointing at when I say science fiction. And I think this has been seen as an excuse for an element of subjectivity in identifying SF. And I think that's kind of lazy thinking. It lacks the rigor and close examination, theorizing and experimentation which allows us to take our pleasure seriously by understanding it more and seeing things in it we didn't see before, which is what that takes you to. Close examination of a text will reveal more and you'll enjoy more and understand it more. That's an important thing, I think. I think really what Knight was really implying when he said that was that there was actually a lot of SF that wasn't labelled as SF, that wasn't marketed as SF, that wasn't promoted or packaged as such, and that a critic can identify things which are SF, even if they're not immediately obviously SF. And I think that's really what he was aiming for. After all, there's loads of it. There's SF everywhere, which isn't sort of packaged and marketed that way. Orwell, Huxley, Atwood, there are many, many, many examples of SF in book form, which are not labelled that way, not marketed that way. In fact, if you look in something like the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, a huge number of those things, maybe 50% of them, have never been labelled that way. They'll get described that way by some critics and commentators and readers, but not by the publishers and the packagers. The idea of genre as a label which is only a marketing category, it's just not enough. Only an analytic theory and experimentation with that theory and applying it to fiction gives us a process in which we can identify SF. So there will be a future video looking at actual definitions, and I'd say I'm fascinated by this and it's a really interesting topic. But for now, I'll just say that for my sort of personal reading, I tested the elements of the novum, paradigm shift, cognitive estrangement and conceptual breakthrough against many different stories as an experiment, as a thought experiment, to see if I feel they conform to that theory of SF or not, and whether that theory is valid. So this work isn't finished yet for me. As a theory, I'm always testing it, and I've drawn on the writing of people like Darko Suvin, Robert Scholes and Samuel R. Delaney in this, as well as some of my own thinking. So I really think that if you kind of shy away from theory too much, you're not really thinking scientifically about science fiction, you're not thinking science fictionally, and that baffles me, because a lot of the really hard SF out there that relies on engineering and physics and that, some of it's beyond me, and yet there's lots of people, lots of really traditional conservative SF fans who only read that sort of hard SF and space opera and what have you, and they seem to really get on with that. So I can't always understand if they can understand the theories in science which are provable, why they can't look at theories in other areas, so maybe they do, maybe it's just a few who don't. Recently I watched a very entertaining video by another YouTuber who loves his SF and he's very passionate about it, which is great, and he argued for a kind of open-minded inclusivity, but almost an anti-theoretical approach, by asking the question, is Watership Down SF? And immediately he concluded the Watership Down was not SF, and I'd say he's absolutely right. If you want to be technical about it and specific, Watership Down is what you call an anthropomorphic fantasy, and that's a subgenre of fantasy where animals are the main characters and they speak and they deliver their narrative and they exhibit human characteristics. Anthro from anthropology, meaning the study of man, and morphic, meaning to change, to morph, to transform. So anthropomorphic fantasy. And lots of SF writers have written it. Watership Down was a big commercial success in that field in the 70s, and a sort of notable one that came along after that in the UK was Duncton Wood by William Howard, which is about moles, and really great guy, William Howard, actually. I sort of interacted with him briefly once. I didn't meet him. I think it was by letter or phone call or fax. It was a long time ago, helping with a customer. I managed to get some Howard books for them and they wanted them signed, and it was one of those sort of things, and he was really, really helpful. So, Gary Kilworth, somebody else I like, he did a series, he did 3 series of anthropomorphic fantasies, the late 80s, early 90s, one about foxes, one about wolves, another about hares. They're a common thing. There was a badger one by somebody called Aaron Clement, I seem to remember, Cold Moons. That was self-published, that was really successful. So it's a common thing, and it goes right the way back, of course, to folk tales and mythology, and it's a staple of children's literature. Something like Wind in the Willows is like the cardinal example of that. So my esteemed fellow YouTuber who was coming up with this argument, he was basically sort of arguing that SF's a broad church for us all to explore. And, I totally agree. And, many SF readers would, they do themselves a heck of a lot of good in terms of enjoying what they read by moving into other areas. And I mean beyond fantasy into all sorts of things, because you can't really judge things really that well without the context, I think, and you need to look at what's happening in other forms of writing and understand it. So, I'm all for that. And I'm all for sort of looking at works and saying, is this SF, or what's the relevance to SF? Is there a theory by which we can accommodate it? Do we reject it? And I think that's a really interesting thing. I've sat in the pub and done it so many times with, with friends and writers and what have you. But there was a kind of dislike of theory in that, as if that could sort of take away the magic or the sense of wonder. And I think this has been a concern, and sense of wonder is a term that was used a lot in the Golden Age. And really, the sense of wonder, the mind expansion that you get from reading good SF, does come from the novum, the new thing, which creates a paradigm shift that you wonder at because you're cognitively estranged, and it allows the writer to create further conceptual breakthroughs. It's the last word of the Weapon Shop series by Van Vogt. It's that sort of thing. Those things are all part of it. So even if you don't recognize those terms and don't recognize them as part of the sense wonder, if you break it down, those are four elements which come together to create that. Nobody wants to take the magic away. And there's a fascinating video, it's a TED talk with Adam Roberts, where he talks about how science fiction is like poetry, and he isn't always that specific or pointed in it, but he basically says that the feeling you get from the imagery of SF, and we're talking about the fundamental imagery, starships, what have you, those sort of things, really is like the feeling of the sublime that you get in romantic poetry. And Adam would know because he writes SF and he teaches poetry, so he knows about all those sort of things. But that is worth thinking about. If you're sort of like going to reject scientific theory when you're looking at science fiction, it seems strangely inconsistent to me, to say the least. So something else that also came up in that video briefly was, and this is interesting in terms of talking about genre, was something that I discussed with Stark Holborn when we did our little interview the other day. And we talked about westerns, so we're both keen on westerns, particularly revisionist westerns, where the sort of traditional tropes are turned on their head. And something that Stark mentioned was the idea that Star Wars was a western. Now, this has been said many times. I personally don't agree. I could see what she's getting at. There's story elements in Star Wars, which are common story elements and motifs in lots of straight-ahead SF, So, but it is interesting as a way of looking at it as genre, because western, of course, isn't really a genre. It's at best a subgenre. It's a type of historical story set in a particular location, the frontier of the United States of America. So it does belong to a certain time and place. And I think if you talk about the Western, you can go right up into something like, say, The Last Picture Show by Larry McMurtry, which is like set in the 50s, where there is still the feel of the frontier. So it is a particular place and time and evolution in history. And this brings us on to the historical novel. I mean, the historical novel isn't a genre either. People say it is, but it's not. After all, how do you define it? When did history end? Yesterday? 50 years ago? 100 years ago? How do you define an historical novel? It's an arbitrary designation. All novels which don't have speculative SF elements are arguably historical novels, unless they're fantasy novels where they have magic in them, and we don't believe in magic anymore, or do we? So, all novels really which are not set in the future are historical novels. So, there isn't really a way of putting a boundary, a category around it. So it doesn't fit into any taxonomical thing. You can see there are certain things like the maritime naval sort of fiction thing. You could work on all these things, but they're all subgenres of realism, is all they are. So when their motifs and common plot points are adapted into SF, it doesn't make any difference. What makes SF is the novum, ultimately, above everything. There's no real theory that supports historical fiction. You can't do it other than by drawing arbitrary lines. And who's going to agree on those? We sort of think that westerns and historical fiction are just subsets. They aren't genres. They're little subgenres of realism. Let's take Valley of Gwangi, which Stark and I mentioned briefly. Valley of Gwangi looks like a western. There's cowboys in it. It's set in the States at the end of that period. It's sort of set early in the century, where the sort of mythology of the West started to be in travelling shows and what have you. And of course, Valley of Grangie isn't a Western at all, even though it might look like one. It's a science fiction story. It's got a novum in it. Gwangi, the surviving Allosaurus, and all the dinosaurs in the valley are science fiction novums. They're a new scientific discovery. Oh, look, all these prehistoric animals survived in this particular area. It's classic SF. It comes from the Lost World. You could say King Kong, because King Kong comes from the Lost World, because Willis O'Brien, who made King Kong, he employed Ray Harryhausen as an animator, and Harryhausen made Valley of Grangie. And Wilson, before he made King Kong, he made the Lost World. So it's all down to Arthur Conan Doyle, who's one of my favourite SF writers. If we're going to look at all this stuff, to be fully able to judge a work of SF, a theory is helpful, as you see, as is the history and context that it comes out of. So where is science fiction now if we look at it in terms of its history and context? Where is it in relation to modernism, the period which ended decades ago, and the contemporary, which is what we're in now, where innovation has slowed down, but technology has moved forward, artistic innovation slowed down. We see this in music. All those things that go into the mix, and we need to consider those questions in terms of elements of things like the hauntology video I did, where I talked about why you like the old covers and those sort of things. So, the evolution of judging SF is going to change in terms of its social and technical context, the world we live in, and that's fascinating stuff. And that's why science fiction, continues to be of interest and of value, or does it? Just to go back to Socrates again and close, he he was sentenced to death by the Athenian state. He was made to drink hemlock, the poison, which, and the charge against him was that he was corrupting Athenian youth. What he was doing was constructing a theory of argument as an intellectual process instead of just gainsaying. So he didn't sit there and say, no, it isn't, yes, it is. He actually said, well, what about the evidence for this? And, through the dialogue which came out of that, you had argument. That's what philosophy is. It's argument. It's getting to that point. And this reminds me of when I read a biography of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher. He's very interesting because he thought it was all about language. And he said the language was like a ladder, and basically philosophical problems were language problems. And when you climbed up the ladder of language and used it properly, you'd then throw it away. He also said that famously, that whereof one cannot speak, one must remain silent. And he meant that specifically in relation to metaphysical things, that they weren't real in the real world, so you couldn't discuss them, which was kind of interesting. So I guess he didn't like fantasy. So Socrates, put to death for encouraging people to think. There's something in that. There really is. Anyway, this is Outlaw Bookseller, signing out for now. See you again soon.